Okay, so it means that the restructuring process in Vietnam will be a long-term issue,
Yes.
right? So can you, what is your opinion about the challenges that Vietnam have to face with in this long process?
Um, the most important thing to keep in mind is that there has to be a determination. A part of restructuring a banking system is recognizing that there are bad loans in the system. And as those bad loans are recognized and dealt with, typically in a process of bank restructuring, there is always a bit of a slowdown in growth in the process of bank restructuring because the banking system is being reformed. Credit growth typically ends up being a bit slower in the process of bank restructuring. So there will be some impact on growth in the system. Uh, there will have to be some difficult decisions that will have to be made. Another important thing to keep in mind is that whenever there is bank restructuring, there is an element of corporate restructuring also that is involved because at the end of the day, we are trying to deal with the borrowers of the banks, but the borrowers of the banks very often, and in fact, a very substantial portion of the lending by the banks is to corporates. So as you restructure the banks, you also have to think about restructuring the corporates that have borrowed from these banks. And as we started discussing in the beginning, several of these borrowers of the banks, which perhaps are in difficulty, are in the real estate sector and amongst the state-owned enterprises. So all of those corporates that have borrowed from the banks would also have to undergo restructuring, and the loans that they've taken from the banking system would either have to be recovered, or if there is no possibility of recovery, then other methods would have to be determined and implemented to sort of deal with the financial situation of those corporates. So the bank restructuring and corporate restructuring are very important and integral and related aspects of any reform process that has to deal with banks. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. So you mean that because the restructuring process of banking system will tightly in relation with the restructuring of the corporates.
Yes.
So it means that it will be very difficult for the government to make some kind of simultaneous actions or
I think the actions would have to be taken on the banking side and on the corporate side at the same time in some respects because recovering some of the bad loans means dealing with the corporates, or in some other cases the bad loans are separated from the bank, put aside in a separate agency and dealt with as a separate problem. uh, and in that respect, I think that what you're asking is a very important question. How do you sequence banking sector reforms and corporate reforms? Should both of them be done at the same time, or does the banking sector reform come first and then the corporate sector reform comes later? Sometimes it's a matter of choice, sometimes it cannot be a matter of choice. It all depends upon how the banks are restructured, whether the corporate sector has to be dealt with by the bank in terms of recovering the bad loans, or the bad loans have to be recovered by an agency outside of the banking sector. So there is an important decision that needs to be made, and your question is very valid. And again, there are many countries which have done this process of corporate and bank restructuring. Thailand did it in a particular way, Indonesia did it in a particular way, and Korea did it in a different way. So there are different models to follow within Asia, and of course across other countries in the world where bank restructurings have been undertaken.
yeah, right. So it means that it's very difficult for the government to decide in which, in what time, in which way they will carry out these two processes, right?
Yes, it would be an important decision to make, and
Yeah.
I'm not familiar enough with the Vietnam situation. It is something that the government has to decide. It's something that the banks would have to decide, and it's something that the central bank would have to be an important decision maker on how they wish to sequence the reforms in these various sectors, in the banking sector, in the corporate sector, and also in terms of the reforms that need to be undertaken at the central bank, so that a situation like this can be avoided in the future. How the supervision has to improve, how the oversight of the central bank over the banking sector has to improve.
Yeah.
And also in terms of the improvements that need to be made in terms of the state-owned enterprises, how corporate governance in the state-owned enterprises has to improve so that they become profitable over the long run, or what other measures need to be taken in the state-owned enterprise sector. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a very long way to go. So in this year, in the new year 2012, what do you think will be the outlook for the banking system of Vietnam?
If the process of restructuring has to continue, I would presume that there are some other smaller, weaker banks that would have to be dealt with first. And the central bank, the SPV, has announced that it intends to deal with some of the other smaller banks over the next few months. But beyond putting together small, weak banks, I think there is a more substantial and substantive decision that needs to be taken about how does the profitability of these banks, how can that be improved? How can the banks be made to deal with their non-performing loans? How can the banking system become a meaningful contributor to the process of economic activity? So I think we should expect to see some more progress of the kind that we saw in December, but what would be much more encouraging is if progress were made in terms of taking steps to improve the profitability in the banking system, some more aggressive and some more meaningful progress in terms of actually restructuring some of the banks, not just taking small banks, weak banks, and merging them together, because all that creates is a bigger, weak bank. It does not create a stronger bank. It does not create a bank that can be meaningfully serving economic activity.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the answers. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.